Hello again, and happy midnight from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia, midnight local time. At 6 a.m. local time on December the 13th, 1981, so nearly 39 years ago, 35 million or so Poles woke, those of them who had access to the television, woke to a different early winter morning. On the screens, they saw the somber, bespectacled face of the country's military dictator, we can say General Wojciech Jaruzelski, who had become the prime minister in February 1981, and the first secretary or secretary general of the Polish United Workers' Party in October 1981. He announced that Poland was on the brink of disaster, and therefore, in order to protect the country and its people, the Council of Ministers or the government had decided to impose a state of martial law or state of siege on Poland. Poland had tried for years to have the best of both worlds, to have close relations with other communist countries, including, of course, the Soviet Union and its other immediate neighbors, East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and yet to have close relations with Western countries. Mr. Edvard Gierek, who had replaced Władysław Gomułka in December 1970 as a result of the unrest on Poland's Baltic coast, where at least tens of people, possibly or more probably hundreds, possibly even over 1,000 had been killed, had tried to appease the Western countries, countries in Western Europe and North America, by claiming that Poland was open for business as long as it was given enough loans from the Western countries. And Poland had indeed experienced a boom in the early and mid 1970s. However, in the late 1970s, this economic boom had turned to a recession. And the shortages of even basic products like bread, meat, and butter and dairy products had become common in the Polish grocery stores. In 1976, there had been further unrest in the industrial city of Radom when enough workers had learned that actually meat was being secretly transported from their factory to the Soviet Union. And actually, the government had announced sharp increases in the prices of basic food products, just like 5.5 years earlier in December 1970. Both times the communist government had had to back down. And finally, in August 1980, thousands of Polish pro-democracy activists had formed the Solidarity Trade Union, and an unemployed technician from the Gdansk dock or port, Mr. Lech Wałęsa, had become its leader. The Polish government had signed a temporary agreement with the Solidarity Trade Union movement in order to calm the country down. But gradually during 1981, the government had tightened its grip on the country and also on the movement. And the martial law's declaration was also directed against the Solidarity Trade Union movement. And according to various contemporary sources, the Soviet Union or its leaders, probably not including the already terminally ill Leonid Brezhnev, who would pass away during the martial law in November 1982, had threatened to occupy Poland with the other Warsaw Pact countries, much like it had done to Czechoslovakia during its brief experiment with socialism with a human face known as the Prague Spring in 1968, let alone Hungary's brief anti-Soviet revolution in 1956, which had been brutally crushed. So Jaruzelski, according to this interpretation, was preempting a possible brutal Soviet and Warsaw Pact response to the Solidarity trade union movement. The martial law, which was suspended at the end of December 1982 and finally lifted in July 1983, meant that the Polish society was militarized. For example, the news journalists on the television all wore military uniforms. Those who had not completed military service or had no military rank wore the plain uniform without any badges of rank. And there was a tight control over the telephone traffic, although according to one Finnish journalist, there was a warning voiceover during that time, or in the 1980s generally in Poland, warning this telephone call is being listened to or monitored. And of course, there was a tightened press censorship, tight censorship over the mass media and communications, telecommunications, and even communication by letter with the foreign countries, especially the Western democracies, was sharply curtailed. Interestingly enough, Lech Wałęsa won, I think, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1983, but he refused to go to Oslo or Stockholm, the Norwegian or the Swedish capital, to accept it, probably Oslo, because he feared that the communist authorities would not allow him back into Poland. Ultimately, it was the Polish communist government that was the loser. And just 15 months after the state of siege had been lifted in October 1984, a prominent critic of the communist government, reform-minded Catholic priest Jerzy Popuje-Wuczko, was abducted by 3 Polish communist police officers or soldiers and then killed brutally. He became a martyr to the trade union movement because he had started to deliver or preach once per month a so-called sermon to the fatherland, where he boldly discussed societal, political, and economic problems. So he didn't limit his preaching to purely religious or spiritual matters. Ultimately, in 1988, Poland would open negotiations with the trade union movement, with the result that in June 1989, partly free parliamentary elections were held in Poland, which the Solidarity trade union won. In August 1989, Mr. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, one of the key figures in the Solidarity trade union movement, formed the first post-World War II non-communist government. And then in 1990, fully free presidential elections were held, which the Solidarity's longtime chairman, Lech Wałęsa, won overwhelmingly. And then in the autumn of 1991, fully free parliamentary elections were held as well. And Poland is now, despite the fact that since 2015, when the right-wing populist and softly Eurosceptic Law and Justice Party won the presidential and parliamentary elections, been moving into a somewhat more authoritarian direction in the sense of the government's control over the judiciary and the mass media. Poland is still much more democratic than, for example, Hungary, which could be described also already as a partly as an authoritarian semi-dictatorship under its populist and strictly right-wing and nationalist leader and prime minister Viktor Orban. But let's read on. Let's start with the text of the partial text of the televised speech that General and Prime Minister and virtual military dictator Jaruzelski delivered starting at 6 a.m. on December the 13th, 1981. Today I address myself to you as a soldier and as the head of the Polish government. I address you concerning extraordinarily important questions. Our homeland is at the edge of an abyss. The achievements of many generations and the Polish home that has been built up from the dust are about to turn into ruins. State structures are ceasing to function. Each day delivers new blows to the waning economy. The atmosphere of conflicts, misunderstanding, hatred uh, causes moral degradation, surpasses the limits of toleration. Strikes, the readiness in many public buildings remained seized. The cries are voiced to physical reprisals with the Reds, with people who have different opinions. The cases of terror, threats, and moral vendetta of even direct violence are on the rise. A wave of impudent crimes, robberies, and burglaries is running across the country. The underground business sharks' fortunes, already reaching millions, are growing. Chaos and demoralization have reached the magnitude of a catastrophe. People have reached the limit of physical, psychological toleration. Many people are struck by despair. Not only days, but hours as well are bringing forth the all national disaster. Citizens, the load of responsibility that falls on me on this dramatic moment in the Polish history is huge. It is my duty to take this responsibility concerning the future of Poland that my generation fought for on all the fronts of the war and for which they sacrificed the best years of their life. I declare that today the Military Council of National Salvation has been formed. In accordance with the Constitution, the State Council has imposed martial law all over the country. I wish that everyone understood the motives of our actions. A military coup, military dictatorship is not our goal. In longer perspective, none of our problems can be solved with the use of violence. The Military Council of National Salvation does not replace constitutional organs of power. Its only purpose is to keep the legal balance of the country, to create guarantees that give a chance to restore order and discipline. This is the ultimate way to bring the country out of the crisis, to save the country from collapse. I appeal to all the citizens. A time of heavy trials has arrived, and we have to stand those in order to prove that we are worthy of Poland. Before all the Polish people and all the world, I would like to repeat the immortal words: Poland has not yet perished so long as we still live. So, what did the martial law mean? According to the government's announcement, there were the following measures. The six basic ones. It was forbidden to convene and hold any kinds of gatherings, processions, and demonstrations, as well as to organize and conduct public collections or gatherings, as well as artistic, entertainment, and sports events without prior permission from the relevant local state administration body, except for services and religious rituals held within churches, chapels, and other places intended solely for these purposes. So this may have been a partial excuse for the murder of Father Jerzy Popiełuszko, that he was not using his Catholic ministry only for religious purposes, but also for societal and political ones. Two, the dissemination of all kinds of publications and information by any means, the public performance of artistic works, and the use of any printing devices without prior consent of the competent authority were prohibited. Three, the right of employees to organize and carry out all kinds of strikes and industrial actions had been suspended. Four, persons staying in public places were obliged to have an identity document with them, and in the case of school students over 13, a school identity card or temporary identity card. Five, the obligation to obtain a permit from the competent local body of state administration for permanent residence in the border zone, and the authority of the citizens' militia for temporary residence in this zone were introduced. Six, practicing tourism, sailing, and rowing sports in the internal and territorial sea waters was prohibited. In addition, conscripts recognized as fit for military service and reserve soldiers, regardless of their purpose, could be called up to active military service at any time on the National Defense Ministry's order. 2. Certain organizational units of state administration and the national tasks particularly important for state defense and security had been militarized, which meant the imposition of specific obligations on persons employed in these units about which these persons would be informed by managers of work establishments. 3. Persons assigned to serve in specific civil defense formations could be obliged to perform active service in civil defense in the time and scope resulting from the performance of tasks. 4. Citizens could be obliged by the competent local state administration bodies and military administration bodies to perform certain personal and material benefits for the defense of the state. Also, the authorized organs of state administration could, 1. Introduce restrictions on the freedom of movement or residence at specific times and places by introducing a curfew or a ban on leaving or arriving to certain regions, cities, and communities. 2. Impose the obligation to obtain prior authorization from the competent local state administration body to change the place of stay, consisting in moving to another town for a period longer than 48 hours, and the obligation to immediately register in the new place of stay. 3. Suspend the activities of associations, trade unions, and social and professional organizations whose activities constituted a threat to the state's security interests, with the exception of churches and religious associations. 4. Introduce censorship of postal items, telecommunications correspondence, and control of telephone calls. 5. Oblige the owners of radio transmitting and transmitting receiving devices to deposit these devices in specified places. 6. Oblige the owners of short firearms, hunting and sporting weapons, as well as ammunition and explosives to deposit them in the indicated places. 7. Prohibit the taking of photographic and film photos and television images of specific objects and places or in certain areas. 8. Prohibit the use of certain badges and uniforms. 9. Suspend or limit the operation of certain communication devices and the provision of postal and telecommunications communication devices. 10. Suspend or limit the carriage of passengers and goods in road, rail, air, and water transport, as well as the movement of motor vehicles on public roads. And 11. Close or limit border passenger and goods traffic through border crossings. And then people of over 17 years of age in relation to whom there was a justified suspicion that, while remaining at liberty, would conduct activities threatening the state's security, could be interned in detention centers for the duration of martial law. But fortunately, the martial law eventually ended. As a consequence of the economic hardships and political repressions, an exodus of Poles saw 700,000 out of a population of about 35 million migrate to the West between 1981 and 1989. A number of international flights were even hijacked in attempts to flee the country and its economic problems. Between December 1980 and October 1983, 11 Polish flights were hijacked to Berlin Tempelhof Airport alone in West Berlin. Around the same time, a group calling themselves the Polish Revolutionary Home Army seized the Polish embassy in Bern, Switzerland on September the 6th, 1982, taking several diplomats as hostages. However, this turned out to be an apparent provocation by the communist Polish secret services aiming to ruin the reputation of the Solidarity movement. The United States imposed economic sanctions against the Polish Republic, or the People's Republic of Poland. In 1982, the United States even suspended the most favored nation's trade status until 1987 and vetoed Poland's application for membership in the International Monetary Fund. The Polish-born Pope John Paul II, originally Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, who had visited Poland in June 1979, which, according to some or several historians, had marked the symbolic start of the pro-democracy protests in Poland, and whom Lech Wałęsa, as a devout Catholic, had visited in early 1981. They had even sung the Polish Catholic patriotic song Boże coś Polskie, or God bless Poland. Wrote a letter to the Primate of Poland, Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, in which he called for peace talks between the state and the workers, supporting the Poles' undeniable right to resolve their problems by themselves.